So we're back with our speakers from our Exploring Science today. We had some great talks about quantum computing and science illustration. So we're just going to get to the questions we couldn't get to during our event. So Chris, we had a few follow-up questions for you about quantum computing. And so the first one was kind of about quantum computers in general. So what are you using to make these quantum computers? And once you make them, how big are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I tried to highlight in my talk, there's not just one way that researchers are trying to build a quantum computer. That's sort of part of this interesting race because no one's sure which technology will win. The one that I personally work with uses superconducting circuits. So this is usually some superconducting material. Most commonly, it's aluminum that's patterned on thin substrates that are typically either sapphire or silicon. And that is what makes up the architecture for a superconducting-based quantum computer. But other kinds of quantum computers, for instance, like trapped ions, looks very different. So in that case, you're actually using a lot of lasers and electric fields to levitate single ions in a vacuum chamber. And so in that case, it's not a ton of electronics in this dilution refrigerator, but just a big vacuum chamber that holds these qubits in the form of single trapped ions. And there are a ton more, which I think are very interesting, but maybe one of the coolest ones are nitrogen vacancy centers. So if you ever take a piece of diamond, there are naturally occurring defects in diamond. And it turns out that you can find these defects in diamond, honestly, even probably in a wedding ring that you might have around. And a defect leaves, for instance, one unpaired electron that can be used as a qubit. So this just goes to show that there are many, many different platforms that people are trying to make a quantum computer with. And depending on the platform, then the corresponding size will be different. And so the size of a dilution refrigerator for the superconducting stuff might be, the size of a small room, but a vacuum chamber might be even larger or smaller depending on the technology. So the answer to how big a quantum computer might be would definitely depend on the type of implementation that it's used.
Cool. So maybe you can make old wedding rings into quantum computers one day?
Maybe.
Awesome. Cool. So some of those things sound like things I've heard in normal computers, like silicon chips. I've heard of those before. So can we combine our quantum computers, maybe if we make them out of those kind of materials, with our normal computers?
Yeah, certainly. And this sort of gets to a more general point, which is, it's very hard to build a quantum computer. And the challenge is making one that works and that is big enough. And so certainly we don't want to use any of the resources in the quantum computer for it to do any computation that is easy for a regular computer. And so ultimately, when we do have a quantum computer, you can certainly bet that it will need to interface with a regular computer and that the problems that we want to solve will only use the quantum computer for the parts that are hard to do on the regular computer. But for everything else, if the regular computer is good enough, then we'll certainly use those resources. So 100%, the first useful quantum computer will definitely be integrated with a normal, probably supercomputer.
Cool. Awesome. So that leads to another couple questions we had about what quantum computers are kind of useful for. And someone asked about that really, really big number you showed. It seemed to me kind of just like a random, really large number, but you said it had two prime factors. So how did you come up with that number, and how do you know that it had two prime factors?
Yeah, so that number I actually pulled from the internet, but generally speaking, so that number was from RSA, which is sort of the general organization that deals with these privacy considerations. And so for context, the reason why that problem was interesting is because the way that we can keep passwords safe is because at the very heart of it, if you wanted to hack into someone's computer or bank account, you get a public key, like anyone can access kind of like a public key, which would be like that large number. But in order to break in, you would need to know the two prime factors. And so because that's a hard problem to do on a regular computer, you can be sure that your information will be safe. That requires sort of this asymmetry. Like if you know the large number with two prime factors, it's hard to find those two prime factors, but it's easy if you know two really large prime numbers to multiply them together to make the key. And that asymmetry is exactly why you can just come up with a password on the top of your head, and the computer will automatically generate the encryption such that when you put that information out there, not everyone can access it. And it turns out that even though it might not seem like it, it's actually rather easy to come up with a large prime number. The algorithm that you use in order to make those numbers is pretty cheap in terms of computation time. And so that's why anyone can sort of just come up with a random password. Computer does a relatively simple task of generating two large prime numbers to multiply together to send out that public key into the world.
Thanks. So then if a quantum computer can find that much easier than a normal computer, will all of our privacy and passwords be ruined once we have a quantum computer?
So if we magically just had a quantum computer like right in this moment and it just appeared, yes, it would be able to really create total chaos in the financial world and just really everything else on the internet. It would basically break the internet. However, we know that a quantum computer is really far away. And so by the time we have quantum computers, we will probably, the government more specifically, will be using those quantum computers to come up with new ways that are quantum encrypted instead of regular encrypted in ways that not even a quantum computer could break. So right now, there are really, it's interesting, there are even just like open calls for people anywhere to just submit these algorithms that could be run on a quantum computer so that the government can ultimately end up making an informed decision on picking the most secure one by the time quantum computers get here. So it'll definitely be a slow transition rather than like a hard line.
Cool. So we're already working on new ways to keep our data safe even before the quantum computers here.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Cool. Well, that was all of our questions, but thanks so much. We got a lot of interest, and I know in the breakout rooms had some great discussions about quantum computing and quantum physics too. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking the questions. A lot of fun.
Yeah, I always find the quantum computers really cool. I still don't understand much about them, but it is good to know that the government is thinking ahead in terms of getting some algorithms figured out. Awesome. Yeah. Cool. So we also had a really awesome presentation from Matt about science illustration and why that's important. And so one of the questions that came up, Matt, that I thought was really interesting was, if the art's not like exactly capturing what the science is that it's trying to depict, is that like false advertising or false educating? For instance, you showed towards the end of your talk the two pictures that were related to evolution. One seemed a lot simpler, but was definitely misleading in some ways, but the other seems so complicated that you might not be able to take anything away from it. So can you talk about the sort of balance there, and is it false advertising, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I think that's a really big consideration that has to be taken into account when people are making scientific illustrations. And it's something that's probably more of a challenge than you encounter in art more in general, right? Like usually you do have some kind of message that people were trying to communicate when they're making art of any kind. But with scientific art in particular, the answer, the thing that you're trying to communicate is kind of set in stone, right? It's set in the facts that we know about the scientific world. And so if your science illustration that you've made, even if you haven't intended it to be so, if it's not accurately communicating the truth that we've found through science, then it's not really doing its job. So it's not good science illustration, and science illustrators have to be very careful about that. And they usually go through a lot of steps of making sure that what they've done does what they want it to do.
I see. But maybe there are some times where it's not such a big deal, like the mitochondria and the kidney being shaped right. But sometimes I guess it could be a worse deal, right?
Yeah. There are definitely some things that, like a little inaccuracy, that can slide, right? If it's for the sake of being able to better communicate the things that are important, then we can survive that, right? If we get so bogged down in the details, because you can go down a huge rabbit hole of all of the things that we have learned in science to be really, really, really accurate, but that can also lose your message in all of that noise. So it's a balancing act between those two sides, and sometimes it's okay to show your mitochondria as kidney beans as long as everybody realizes that those are mitochondria.
I see. That makes sense. Yeah, sometimes you have to, it's just not possible to depict everything in order to be sensible. You have to, sometimes less is more, even if it's not perfectly scientifically accurate.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think there were questions during your talk about, or you definitely alluded to the fact that biologists back in the day had to be good illustrators. But you did say that, you can't draw very well, I can't draw very well. So you don't have to be a good illustrator anymore to be a scientist. But what about the reverse direction? Do you have to be a scientist to be a science illustrator? How does that work?
So I will say that a lot of science illustrators have a good background in science. It's really, really helpful to be able to come into whatever scientific field that you're going to help by making your illustration. If you have some understanding of how that field works, some of the basic facts behind it, so you have a good basis to work up from, so that when you're talking with the scientists that you're going to talk with in the field, because they're the experts and they're specialized, you can more easily get to, these are the things that we want to show, or you can understand what the scientists are telling you. So you don't have to be a really specialized scientist. You don't have to know all of the ins and outs of the field that you're going to make an illustration for. But usually you do have to have like a good background in science to be a really, really good science illustrator. It takes out some of the gray area that could be there if you were coming purely from an artistic standpoint.
That makes sense. Just sort of meeting people in the middle, sort of. So you talked a lot about science illustration, the pros and cons of it, why it's important, and you mentioned that you're in the virology field. So can you talk maybe about a graphic that you've made recently that you're really proud of, or maybe one in general that you've made that you think you really succeeded in getting your message across?
Yeah, actually, so my field is a little bit interesting in that we focus a lot on what we can sort of visually see and demonstrate. So like I said, I work with viruses, and in particular, I look at the little tiny pieces of the viruses that end up making the whole. So if you can think back to the coronavirus image, right? And the popular pictures that we have out in the media, it's usually like a little gray ball, and it's got these like red spiky things sticking up from the surface. So those red spiky things are one small part of coronavirus, and one thing that we've done is we have figured out in really, really fine detail what those red spiky things look like. And so I can take this data that we found and move it into a computer program and show it as sort of a graphical thing, and we can sort of like zoom around this graphical 3D depiction of this spiky thing that comes out of the coronavirus to look at some of the details that help it stay together or do its job, and that can give us a little bit of information about how it works, how the coronavirus is so infectious, and so stuff like that. I'd say is a cooler graphic that I have put together. It's all animated and it follows along with how I want to talk about it. So I think that's cool, but it's probably not something that a general audience would be like, yeah, that's really exciting. But for me, it's good.
But it sounds like, since a lot of scientists are working on coronavirus and other viruses from a lot of different angles, that if you're able to show that picture to a cell biologist, for instance, and they're able to really get their head around how that spike works, then maybe that will help them understand something else, right? Even if it's not for a general audience.
Definitely. And actually, all of this work that we're doing is in collaboration with other scientists and scientific groups that are tackling coronavirus from different angles. So if my lab focuses on these really, really small details of how these spike things look, right? We're also working a lab that works on antibodies, which you might have heard about. Another lab that's looking at it from the point of this is how coronavirus gets into the cells. And so all of us are communicating and giving each other the new info that we've learned. And that's really, really important that scientists from a bunch of different backgrounds can come together and communicate with one another, just like how it's important for a science illustrator to be able to take scientific understanding that we know and bring it out to the rest of us.
Awesome. And I guess sort of bringing us full circle with the idea of the coronavirus pandemic and the general public. So can you talk a little bit about how science illustration can help us understand the pandemic, especially for a general audience?
I muted myself there. Yeah, so this is a point in time where something that has a scientific nature is really, really affecting all of us on a very deep level, right? And all of a sudden, all of us out here in the public world are being surrounded by phrases that have a lot of scientific meaning ingrained into them, whose meaning doesn't come clearly to us, right? So I talked a little bit about flattening the curve in my talk, but you could also think about this if you've got some really science-minded journalists and they're talking about like R0 or R0, which is how we can describe how infectious the disease is. There are a lot of these scientific terms that allow us to describe why coronavirus is a big deal or how we can help prevent coronavirus from infecting our communities. And just saying words to people can get you a certain way, right? It's useful for us to have talks like these. But if you have a really good science illustration, you can potentially communicate a lot more than you can with words. And you can do it quickly, right? You can just get somebody's attention. They can be like, oh, okay, I understand that more than I did before. And when we need everybody in society to kind of come together and act a certain way in order to help prevent a pandemic like this from infecting and killing a whole bunch of us, having really good methods of communication is absolutely vital.
All right, well, thanks again to Matt and Chris. You guys had fantastic talks, and I know the students were super excited about them. And so we look forward to seeing everybody next time for our next week of Exploring Science. Thanks.
Thanks
for having us.